Maggie had never been the kind of person to seek out conflict. She was a doctor, someone who spent her days fixing problems, not creating them. When she finally bought her first house, a modest but well-kept home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she expected peace, stability, and a place where she could unwind after long shifts. She wasn't interested in small talk with the neighbors or getting involved in whatever social politics existed on the street. She just wanted to live her life, take care of her home, and enjoy the simple satisfaction of finally having a place to call her own. The first few weeks were uneventful. She settled into a routine, unpacked boxes, set up her furniture, and started making the house feel like home. The neighborhood itself seemed pleasant enough: quiet streets, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of suburban normalcy that made it seem like nothing bad ever happened there. But then came the first encounter with Karen. Maggie had noticed her before, a woman in her mid-50s with a permanent expression of disapproval, always watching the street from her front porch, as if she were the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. Maggie had seen her gossiping with the other homeowners, pointing at different houses as they nodded along. She hadn't paid much attention at first, but that changed the day Karen decided to introduce herself. It happened in the driveway. Maggie had just come home from work, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to get inside and collapse on her couch. As she stepped out of her car, Karen was already walking toward her, a practiced smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi there, dear, you must be Maggie," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced friendliness. Maggie nodded, wary but polite. "That's me. And you are?" "Karen." "I live just over there," she gestured to the house across the street, the one with the perfectly trimmed hedges and the kind of decorative seasonal wreath that suggested she took her home very seriously. "I'm on the neighborhood committee. Just wanted to welcome you properly and go over a few things about living here." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Go over a few things." "Yes," Karen said, smiling wider. "Just some simple guidelines we like to follow to keep the neighborhood looking its best. I noticed your car has been parked in the driveway quite a bit. Most of us keep our vehicles in the garage, it's just more aesthetically pleasing that way. And your front lawn, it's lovely, of course. But I'd recommend a more uniform trim. It keeps everything looking nice and cohesive. Oh, and that garage of yours, the one in the back, have you thought about painting it? It looks a little worn." Maggie stared at her for a moment, processing. "I didn't realize there were rules about any of that." "Well," Karen said, tilting her head, "it's not about rules, dear. It's about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. People take pride in their homes here, and we all do our part to keep things looking appropriate. I just assumed you'd want to be a good neighbor." Maggie had dealt with people like this before: passive-aggressive, controlling, people who believed they had unspoken authority over everyone else simply because they had lived somewhere longer. She had no patience for it. "I appreciate the input, but I'll be keeping my car in my driveway. My garage is full of things I'm still unpacking. As for my lawn, I think it looks fine. And the garage, well, I like it the way it is," Maggie said flatly. Karen's smile twitched. "I see. Well, we do have standards here. I'd hate for you to feel out of place." "I think I'll be just fine," Maggie replied, and without another word, she walked past Karen and into her house. That was the moment she knew Karen was going to be a problem. It started with little things. The way Karen would watch her house as if waiting for something to complain about. The way some of the neighbors who had been friendly at first started acting distant, almost hesitant to interact with her. Then came the notes. Small, printed notices left on her door, unsigned, but all saying the same thing in different ways: "This isn't how we do things here. Consider making adjustments for the sake of the community. It's important to fit in." Maggie ignored them. She wasn't about to let some overbearing busybody dictate how she lived in her own house. But then, one morning, everything escalated. She stepped outside to find her car missing. For a moment, she thought it had been stolen. But then she noticed the piece of paper taped to her front door. Tearing it down, she read it quickly, her pulse spiking. "Your vehicle has been removed due to non-compliance with community regulations. Please contact the appropriate authorities for retrieval." There was no signature, no official letterhead, Just those words, typed out in a way that made her stomach turn. Maggie grabbed her phone and called the police. When she reported her car missing, the dispatcher checked the records and calmly informed her that the vehicle hadn't been stolen, it had been towed, by who Maggie demanded. It was reported as an unauthorized vehicle on private property, the dispatcher said. You'll need to contact the impound lot for details. Maggie clenched her jaw. This is my property. The dispatcher hesitated. Well, ma'am, according to the report, the vehicle was parked in violation of community guidelines. You may need to speak with your neighborhood committee about this. Maggie felt a cold rage settle in her chest. She already knew exactly who was responsible. She didn't bother calling Karen. She didn't want to waste her breath on whatever fake, syrupy excuse the woman would give her. Instead, she got into a ride share and went straight to the impound lot. When she arrived, the clerk behind the counter barely glanced up as she handed over her information. He pulled up the record, frowning slightly as he read through the notes. "Ha," he muttered. What Maggie asked, already on edge. "This is weird," he said, tapping the screen. "Your car was impounded under a different name." Maggie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, a different name?" "The report lists the registered owner as someone else. Not you," he looked at her. "Says here the owner approved the tow." Maggie felt her hands curl into fists. "That's not possible. I own that car." "Yeah, I figured something was off," the clerk said. "The request was submitted yesterday, but the signature doesn't match the one on the vehicle's original registration. Looks like someone tried to file a transfer of ownership." Maggie's blood ran cold. Someone had tried to erase her claim to her own car, and she had a very strong feeling she knew exactly who was behind it. Maggie stood in the impound lot, staring at the clerk as the words sank in. Someone had tried to transfer ownership of her car. Someone had forged her signature, submitted fake documents, and made it appear as if she no longer had any claim to her own vehicle. It was an absurd, impossible thing to process. This wasn't a simple clerical mistake, this was intentional, deliberate. Someone had planned this. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Can I see the paperwork?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The clerk hesitated, glancing around as if debating whether he should even be showing her this information. "Technically, I shouldn't," he admitted, "but something about this feels off. Give me a second." He disappeared into the back office, leaving Maggie standing there, fists clenched at her sides. Every part of her wanted to storm across the street to Karen's house and demand answers, but she knew that was exactly what Karen would want. If Maggie lost her temper, it would only work against her. She had to be smart. Careful. If Karen wanted to play dirty, Maggie would play smarter. The clerk returned a moment later, holding a file. "Here. I can't let you take this, but I can let you look." Maggie flipped through the papers quickly. The transfer request had been submitted electronically the day before, listing the new owner as Karen Dawson. Her signature had been forged, but whoever had done it hadn't even tried to mimic her real handwriting. It was a sloppy, almost laughable attempt, except there was nothing funny about what was happening. The document claimed she had willingly signed over the vehicle, that it had been an official transaction. Attached was a fabricated bill of sale, dated 2 weeks earlier. Maggie's stomach twisted. If they were willing to go this far over a car, what else were they capable of? She snapped a picture of the document with her phone, then looked at the clerk. How did this even get approved? He sighed, rubbing his temples. Honestly, these things slip through sometimes. If the paperwork looks legitimate enough, it gets processed. But something like this, if you dispute it fast enough, you can get it reversed. How fast is fast enough? Couple of days max. You're lucky you caught it now. Lucky. She almost laughed. Nothing about this felt lucky. Maggie thanked him and paid the impound fee, gritting her teeth as she handed over her credit card. She shouldn't have to pay to get her own car back. It was infuriating, but she knew she had bigger problems. Once the payment was processed, the clerk handed her the keys and gave her a sympathetic look. You should probably talk to the police, he said. Oh, I will, she muttered, turning on her heel and heading toward her vehicle. She drove straight to the police station, parked, and walked inside, feeling the weight of everything settle on her shoulders. At the front desk, a bored-looking officer glanced up at her. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Maggie said, placing the forged documents on the counter. "I need to report fraud." The officer skimmed the papers, eyebrows raising slightly. "This is unusual," he admitted, "but technically this is a civil matter. We don't usually get involved in property disputes unless there's evidence of criminal intent." Maggie's patience thinned. "Someone stole my car on paper. They forged legal documents. That is criminal intent." The officer exhaled through his nose, clearly debating how much effort he wanted to put into this. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll file a report. But if you want actual action taken, you'll need to get a lawyer involved." "I already planned on it." The report was filed, though Maggie had little faith that the police would do much. As she left the station, she made another call to her lawyer, Brian, who had helped her with the house purchase. When she explained the situation, he was silent for a long moment. "That's brazen," he finally said. "I've seen some nasty real estate disputes, but someone forging your signature and trying to claim your car? That's another level." "What do I do?" Maggie asked. "I'll handle reversing the fraudulent transfer," he assured her. "But I think you need to start considering the bigger picture here."
What do you mean?
Brian sighed. "Maggie, this isn't just about your car. Someone is trying to erase your presence. First, they took your vehicle off your property. Next, they tried to make it look like it was never yours to begin with. If they're willing to do that, what's stopping them from going after your house?" A cold chill ran down her spine. "They can't do that. The deed is in my name." Brian hesitated. "Yes, but if someone was bold enough to forge your name on a car transfer, what makes you think they won't try something similar with your house?" She clenched her jaw. "What do I do?" "I'll start looking into anything suspicious related to your property," Brian said. "You, in the meantime, need to document everything. Keep records of every interaction, every notice, every strange occurrence. If this escalates, we'll need proof." Maggie hung up feeling a mix of anger and unease. The idea that someone could manipulate legal records so easily that they could try to steal what was hers right out from under her was infuriating. But Brian was right, this wasn't just about the car. This was something bigger. When she pulled into her driveway, Karen was outside, standing near her mailbox. Their eyes met, and Karen smiled, that same condescending, knowing smirk that made Maggie's blood boil. Maggie stepped out of the car, slamming the door shut. She wasn't in the mood to play games. "Enjoy your little stunt." Karen tilted her head. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Maggie took a step closer. "You forged my name. Tried to take my car. Do you really think you'll get away with it?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "I don't know what kind of accusations you're making, dear, but I suggest you be careful. It's not a good look, making trouble with your neighbors." Maggie laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You want me gone. That's what this is about, right? You don't like that I don't fall in line, so you're trying to push me out." Karen sighed, almost as if she were disappointed. "Maggie, you don't belong here. This isn't your kind of neighborhood. People like you never last. You're better off leaving before things get complicated." The implied threat sent a spike of fury through Maggie's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She met Karen's gaze, unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere." Karen's smile widened. "We'll see." With that, she turned and walked back inside her house, leaving Maggie standing in her driveway, fists clenched. Maggie took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to be intimidated. If Karen wanted a war, she'd get one. But Maggie wasn't going to fight on Karen's terms. No, she was going to fight smart. She pulled out her phone and made another call. "Brian, I need you to check something else for me. Look into the last few owners of this house." There was a beat of silence. Then Brian said, "I was already planning to. I have a feeling you're not the first one Karen's done this to." Maggie tightened her grip on the phone. "I need to know exactly what happened to them." Maggie woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She reached for it, still groggy, and saw an email notification from Brian. The subject line read, "Preliminary findings your house." She sat up, suddenly wide awake, and opened the email. The body of the message was short but unnerving. "Maggie, I've started pulling records on the previous owners of your house. 2 of the last 3 owners sold their properties under suspicious circumstances, both claiming financial difficulties, despite having no major debts prior to moving in. The 3rd owner was listed as deceased. And the sale was handled by an executor who filed everything through private channels. I'll dig deeper, but it looks like there's a pattern here. Call me when you can. Brian." A pattern. Maggie had suspected as much after the incident with her car, but seeing it spelled out made her stomach churn. Karen and whoever was working with her had done this before, pressured people until they either sold their homes for a fraction of their value or left under mysterious circumstances. But why? What did Karen stand to gain from driving people out? And how far was she willing to go to achieve it? As she got out of bed and began her day, those questions lingered in her mind, casting a shadow over everything she did. She kept her phone close, waiting for Brian to find more information, but the hours passed without any updates. By midday, she decided she couldn't sit around and wait any longer. If Karen wanted to escalate things, Maggie would be ready. She drove to the local records office, determined to see what she could find about the history of her property. The clerk at the counter, a middle-aged woman with a distracted air, barely looked up when Maggie approached. "I'm looking for records on my property," Maggie said, sliding a piece of paper with her address across the counter. The clerk sighed, adjusted her glasses, and began typing on her keyboard. After a few moments, she frowned. "That's odd," she muttered. "What's odd?" Maggie asked, her pulse quickening. The clerk glanced at her. "There's a gap in the records. Usually we have a clear chain of ownership, but it looks like some documents are missing for this property. I can see the sale to you and the last owner, but before that," she trailed off, squinting at the screen. "It's like someone removed parts of the history." "Removed?" Maggie echoed, her voice sharp. "Is that even legal?" The clerk shrugged. "Depends. If it was done under a court order, it might be. But it's definitely not common." "Is there any way to find out who removed them?" "Not easily. You'd need a court order yourself to investigate that." Maggie's frustration boiled over, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Can I at least get copies of what's available?" "Sure, it'll take a few minutes to print everything." As she waited, Maggie's mind raced. Missing records, sudden financial troubles, mysterious deaths, it was all too much to be a coincidence. Karen had to be involved, but she couldn't be doing this alone. There was something bigger going on, and Maggie had to figure out what it was before it was too late. When the clerk returned with a stack of papers, Maggie thanked her and left, heading straight home to pore over the documents. She spread them out on her dining table, scanning each page for anything unusual. At first, nothing stood out, just standard deeds, sales agreements, and tax records. But then she noticed something odd. One of the previous owners, a man named Richard Keene, had sold the house for significantly less than its market value. The reason listed in the records was vague, unforeseen financial hardship. Maggie frowned. She remembered Brian's email mentioning financial difficulties, but there was no indication of what had caused them. She made a mental note to ask him to dig into Richard Keene's background. The next file detailed the sale to the owner before her, an older woman named Ellen Moore. Ellen's name had come up in Brian's email as well, but what caught Maggie's attention was a small note at the bottom of the document: sale facilitated by community representative. The signature was illegible, but Maggie didn't need to read it to know who the community representative was. Karen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Maggie's heart jumped. She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood slowly, her mind already racing through possibilities. Was it Karen? Someone else? Taking a deep breath, she peered through the peephole and felt a surge of anger. It was Karen, standing on the porch with her arms crossed, a smug expression plastered across her face. Maggie opened the door just enough to glare at her. "What do you want?" Karen's smile widened. I just thought I'd stop by to see how you're settling in. Everything all right? Cut the act, Karen. What are you really doing here? Karen feigned innocence, placing a hand over her chest. Why, Maggie, I'm just being a good neighbor. I couldn't help but notice some unusual activity around your property recently. You know, strangers coming and going, it's not very neighborly. Unusual activity, Maggie repeated, her voice cold. You mean like someone towing my car without cause? Or forging my signature on legal documents? Karen's expression didn't falter. If anything, she seemed amused. Those are some serious accusations. You really should be careful about making baseless claims. It might give people the wrong idea. Maggie stepped forward, narrowing the gap between them. You can play this game all you want, Karen, but I'm not going anywhere. And when I figure out exactly what you're up to, you'll regret ever starting this. For a brief moment, Karen's mask slipped. Her smile faded and something darker flickered in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual condescension. Well, I suppose we'll see, won't we? She turned and walked away, leaving Maggie standing in the doorway, seething. Karen wasn't even trying to hide her involvement anymore. She was confident, too confident, that Maggie wouldn't be able to stop her. But Maggie wasn't going to let Karen win. That night, Maggie stayed up late, combing through the documents again and compiling everything she had. By the time she finally went to bed, she had a growing list of questions and a sinking feeling that the answers wouldn't come easily. The next morning, Maggie woke to another problem. As she stepped outside to check her mail, she noticed something strange about her water meter. It had been tampered with, scratches around the lid, the seal broken. Her water pressure had been fine the day before, but now it was barely a trickle. She called the utility company, and when the technician arrived, he confirmed her suspicions. Someone's been messing with this, he said, frowning as he inspected the meter. It looks like they tried to shut it off but didn't do it properly. Can you fix it? Maggie asked. Yeah, but you should probably file a report. This kind of thing doesn't just happen on its own. Another report. Another incident to add to the growing list of ways Karen and her allies were trying to make her life miserable. Maggie watched as the technician worked, her anger simmering beneath the surface. When he left, she decided enough was enough. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for Karen's next move. It was time to take the fight to her. Maggie spent the rest of the day making phone calls, first to Brian, then to a private investigator recommended by one of her colleagues. If Karen thought she could intimidate Maggie into giving up, she was about to learn how wrong she was. By the time the sun set, Maggie had a plan. She didn't know exactly what Karen was after, but she was going to find out, and she wasn't going to stop until she exposed whatever scheme Karen was running. As she locked her doors and set up a makeshift barricade in front of the garage, Maggie felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting to prove that no one, not Karen, not anyone, could take what was hers. And she wasn't going to lose. The following morning, Maggie woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on her nightstand. Blinking against the morning light, she saw Brian's name flashing on the screen. She picked up immediately, her pulse quickening. "We have a problem," Brian said without any preamble, his tone sharp and urgent. "What kind of problem?" Maggie asked, sitting up straight. "I went deeper into the property records, just like you asked. It turns out there's more than just missing documents. The last two owners of your house filed complaints against what was listed as the community association. Both claimed they were being harassed, illegal fines, false maintenance violations, and even threats to their personal safety. But both cases were dismissed. The records show no follow-up investigation." Maggie's grip on the phone tightened. What happened to them? The first owner, Richard Keene, sold the property for way under its market value. He disappeared off the radar right after. The second, Ellen Moore, passed away a few months after the sale. Her death was ruled natural causes, but Brian hesitated. But what Maggie pressed. She wrote a letter to her attorney just days before she died, claiming she felt unsafe in the house. The attorney didn't file it officially, but it's in her case notes. "I think someone scared her enough to sell, then made sure she couldn't talk afterward." Maggie felt her stomach twist into knots. Karen's involvement was no longer just about harassment or petty neighborhood politics. This was a pattern, deliberate and methodical, and Maggie knew she was next on their list. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "I'm filing a formal inquiry with the local authorities to reopen the complaints, but that's going to take time. In the meantime, you need to watch your back. I don't think Karen's working alone. This is bigger than her, Maggie." Maggie hung up, her mind racing. The quiet neighborhood she had dreamed of was now a trap, and she was its latest target. Karen had clearly perfected her methods over the years, and the thought of Ellen Moore's final days sent a chill through her. Determined not to fall into the same pattern, Maggie decided to be proactive. She started her day by organizing every piece of evidence she had collected: copies of the fraudulent documents, the tampered water meter report, and her notes about Karen's behavior. She scanned them all into her computer and backed them up on multiple drives. If Karen or her allies tried to escalate further, Maggie would be ready to fight back. But as the day wore on, the tension only grew. Around midday, Maggie noticed something unusual: a black SUV parked just a few houses down. It was subtle at first, but she couldn't ignore the way the driver seemed to linger, occasionally glancing in her direction. She tried to brush it off as paranoia, but when the car was still there hours later, her instincts kicked in. Maggie decided to test her theory. She walked out to her mailbox, pretending to check for letters, and glanced toward the SUV. The driver, a man wearing dark sunglasses, turned his head quickly, as if trying to avoid eye contact. Maggie felt her pulse spike. Someone was watching her. She went back inside, locked the door, and immediately called Brian. "Someone's parked outside my house," she said, her voice low. "I think they're watching me." Brian cursed under his breath. "Don't engage. Stay inside and document everything. Take pictures of the car if you can. I'll contact someone I know in law enforcement to see if they can run the plates." Maggie hung up, grabbed her phone, and cautiously peered through the curtains. The SUV was still there, unmoving. She snapped a few photos, careful not to draw attention to herself, and sent them to Brian. Then she sat down at her kitchen table, her mind racing. If Karen had people watching her, it meant they were preparing to act. Maggie couldn't afford to wait for their next move. She needed more information, something concrete to tie Karen to the larger scheme. Later that afternoon, Maggie made the decision to visit one of her elderly neighbors, Mrs. Daniels, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. If anyone knew the history of the area, it would be her. Maggie brought over a basket of baked goods as an excuse to chat, hoping Mrs. Daniels would open up. As soon as Maggie mentioned Karen, the older woman's face darkened. "That woman," Mrs. Daniels said, shaking her head. "She's been running things around here for years. Always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. People are afraid of her, you know." "Afraid of her?" "Why?" Maggie asked. Mrs. Daniels hesitated, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "She has a way of making problems for people. My son tried to fight her once. This was years ago, mind you. She claimed his fence was violating property lines, even though it had been there for decades. He ended up moving out after she filed some kind of complaint with the city. Said it wasn't worth the trouble." "Do you think she's behind what happened to the last 2 owners of my house?" Maggie asked carefully. Mrs. Daniels sighed. "I wouldn't put it past her. Karen always seems to have connections, people who can pull strings. And if she's set her sights on you, dear, you need to be careful. She doesn't like to lose." Maggie thanked Mrs. Daniels for her time and returned home with a sinking feeling in her chest. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was a manipulator with the power to ruin lives, and Maggie was next in line. That evening, as Maggie was reviewing her notes, her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "The plates on that SUV belong to a private security firm. Looks like Karen hired professionals." Maggie's heart pounded. Private security? This wasn't just neighborhood intimidation anymore. Karen was escalating, and Maggie had to prepare for whatever was coming next. The next morning, Maggie woke up to find a new notice taped to her front door. It was from a law firm, claiming that her property was under review for code violations, and that she was required to provide proof of compliance within 72 hours. The notice was vague, listing no specific violations, but it was enough to make her blood boil. She immediately called Brian, who confirmed her suspicions. "This is a scare tactic," he said. "They're trying to make you panic. Don't respond directly, let me handle it." But as the day progressed, Maggie realized that Karen wasn't just trying to scare her, she was trying to isolate her. Several neighbors who had been friendly before now avoided her completely, crossing the street or closing their doors when she walked by. It was clear that Karen was spreading lies about her, turning the community against her one person at a time. By the end of the day, Maggie felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She was being watched, harassed, and slowly cut off from any support system. But she refused to give in. If Karen thought she could break her, she was in for a rude awakening. That night, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pile of evidence she had collected. She knew she needed to act, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. As much as it pained her to admit, she needed help. And she had an idea of where to start. The next morning, Maggie reached out to a journalist she knew from her college days, someone who had a reputation for digging into corruption and exposing the truth. If Karen wanted to play dirty, Maggie was about to shine a spotlight on her entire operation. The next morning, Maggie woke up feeling the tension in her body like a tightly wound spring. She couldn't shake the thought of the private security firm parked outside her house the previous day, nor the vague legal notice Karen had taped to her door. The walls were closing in, and every passing moment felt like an escalation she wasn't fully prepared for. But she was also done being a passive target. She wasn't going to let Karen dictate the rules anymore. After spending hours compiling every piece of evidence she had, Maggie made the first call of the day to her lawyer, Brian. "I need to know if there's a way to counter this notice they gave me," she said without preamble. "I've already started working on it," Brian replied. "They're fishing, Maggie. These notices are intentionally vague because they want you to panic and hand them something they can use against you. But they can't actually force you to comply without specifics, and even if they had something, it would need to go through the proper channels." "So it's just intimidation," she muttered, gripping the phone tightly. "Exactly. But we need to be careful. If Karen's using a private security firm, it means she's willing to put real money and effort into making your life miserable. I'm going to contact the firm and demand to know what their involvement is. They'll try to hide behind client confidentiality. But there are ways to apply pressure." Maggie thanked him and hung up, but the call only gave her a momentary sense of relief. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had already set the next phase of her plan in motion. And sure enough, by noon, the next blow came. It started with a sudden loss of power. Maggie had been working on her laptop when everything went dark. At first, she thought it was a neighborhood outage, but when she stepped outside, she realized every other house on the street still had power. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she made her way to the electrical box at the side of her house. The lock on it was broken, and someone had physically switched it off. She called the utility company immediately, demanding they send someone to repair the damage and secure the box. The representative on the other end of the line sounded apologetic but unhelpful. "Unfortunately, tampering with your meter isn't something we can prevent, ma'am," they said. "We can come out and repair it, but we recommend contacting law enforcement if you believe someone is deliberately targeting your property." Maggie hung up, frustrated but unsurprised. She already knew this was Karen's doing. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore first the car, then the water, now the electricity. It was all meant to wear her down, make her feel powerless. By the time the utility technician arrived, Maggie was standing outside with her arms crossed, watching the street for any sign of Karen or her allies. She didn't have to wait long. Karen emerged from her house across the street just as the technician started working, her ever-present smirk firmly in place. "Problem with your power," Karen called out, her tone dripping with false concern. Maggie didn't answer, but the sharp glare she shot Karen's way was enough to make her neighbor chuckle. "I keep telling you, dear, this neighborhood has its challenges. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Maggie clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay silent. Engaging Karen now wouldn't accomplish anything except giving her the satisfaction of knowing she was getting under Maggie's skin. Instead, Maggie went back inside, locked the door, and called Brian again. "I need to know if there's any way to prove she's behind this," she said as soon as he picked up. "I'm already looking into it," Brian replied. But without direct evidence like footage of her tampering with the electrical box, it's going to be hard to make a case. Have you considered installing security cameras? I already have, Maggie said. But they don't cover the side of the house where the meter is. I'll fix that today. Good. And Maggie, be careful. People like Karen thrive on pushing boundaries. If she's willing to go this far, there's no telling what she'll do next. After hanging up, Maggie drove to the nearest hardware store and bought a new set of security cameras with motion sensors and night vision. She spent the next few hours installing them, making sure every vulnerable point around her property was covered. If Karen or anyone else tried something again, she'd have the proof she needed to take action. But even as she worked, the unease in her chest grew heavier. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had more in store. Her instincts were proven right that night. Around 3 a.m., Maggie was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and crept to the front of the house, peeking through the curtains. Her stomach dropped. Someone had thrown a brick through her living room window. She called the police immediately, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. "It's harassment," she said. "It's been escalating for weeks. My car, my utilities, and now this." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent out, but Maggie already knew how it would go. Unless she had direct evidence tying Karen to the act, the police wouldn't do much beyond filing a report. When the officer arrived, he confirmed her fears. After inspecting the damage and taking her statement, he gave her a sympathetic look. "Unfortunately, without witnesses or video footage, there's not much we can do. I recommend keeping your security cameras running and documenting everything." Maggie nodded, though her frustration was palpable. She thanked the officer and watched as he drove away, leaving her alone in the dark, empty street. By the next morning, Maggie's resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. If Karen wanted a fight, she'd get one. But Maggie wasn't going to play by Karen's rules anymore. Her first call was to the private investigator Brian had recommended, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, who specialized in uncovering corruption. Maggie explained the situation in detail, laying out every incident and every piece of evidence she had. "This isn't just about me," Maggie said. "Karen's done this before. She's targeting people, driving them out, and somehow profiting off it. I need to know how." Diane listened carefully, then asked a single question: "Are you ready for things to get messy?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes." Diane promised to start digging immediately, and Maggie felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. But she knew it would take time, and in the meantime she needed to keep herself and her home safe. That evening, Maggie received another blow. A letter arrived in the mail, this one marked as an official notice from the county zoning board. The letter claimed that her property was under review for multiple violations, including an unauthorized structure and improper use of residential space. The garage, it said, was not in compliance with local regulations and would need to be demolished unless she could provide proof of its legality within 14 days. Maggie stared at the letter, her anger simmering beneath the surface. It was Karen's fingerprints all over again, another attempt to undermine her claim to the property, but Maggie wasn't going to let Karen win. The next morning, she called the zoning board directly, demanding to know who had filed the complaint. The clerk on the other end of the line sounded confused. "I don't see anything in the system about your property," he said after a few moments. "Are you sure this letter is from us?" Maggie froze. "You're saying it's fake?" "It's possible," the clerk said. "Can you send me a copy? I'll have someone look into it." After hanging up, Maggie scanned the letter and emailed it to the clerk, her heart pounding. If Karen was forging official documents to intimidate her, it meant she was willing to cross legal boundaries. It also meant Maggie now had something tangible to use against her. By the time Diane called later that day with her first update, Maggie felt like she was standing on the edge of a storm. "Karen's got a lot of skeletons in her closet," Diane said. "But the most interesting thing, she's tied to a local real estate developer who's been buying up properties in this neighborhood for years. Cheap properties." Maggie's breath caught. "You think she's working for him?" "Or with him," Diane said. "Either way, it's no coincidence. Karen's not just a petty bully, she's part of a system. And your house is in their crosshairs. Maggie hung up, her mind racing. Everything was starting to fall into place: the harassment, the forged documents, the escalating threats. Karen wasn't acting alone. She was part of something much larger, and Maggie was determined to tear it all down. As she sat in her kitchen, staring at the shattered glass still scattered across the floor, Maggie made herself a promise. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to expose Karen and everyone working with her. And she was going to make sure they never did this to anyone else again. Maggie sat in her car outside the office of the private investigator, Diane, staring at her phone. Her palms were damp and her chest felt tight. She had just received a call from Diane that confirmed her worst fears. Karen wasn't just a lone actor in some neighborhood power trip. She was deeply connected to a larger scheme involving a real estate developer with a history of predatory practices. And now, the evidence Maggie and Diane had gathered pointed to Karen using her position in the community to harass homeowners into selling below market value, clearing the way for the developer to swoop in and profit. It was all starting to make sense: the fake notices, the tampering with utilities, the way neighbors seemed to distance themselves as soon as Karen got involved. This wasn't just about Maggie's house. It was about control. Karen was the enforcer, the developer was the benefactor, and Maggie was just the latest in a long line of victims. But this time they'd picked the wrong target. Maggie took a deep breath, steeling herself before heading inside. Diane was waiting for her, a folder full of documents spread across her desk. "It's all here," Diane said, gesturing for Maggie to sit. Karen's connections to the developer, the properties that have changed hands under suspicious circumstances, even a few emails I managed to recover from a public records request. She's sloppy in some areas, but her influence runs deep. You were right. This isn't just harassment. It's a coordinated effort. Maggie's eyes scanned the documents, her anger growing with every detail. One email stood out. Karen had reported Maggie's garage as a zoning violation directly to a city official who, as Diane pointed out, had ties to the same developer. The timing was damning. Karen had filed the complaint mere days after Maggie had stood her ground during their driveway confrontation. "We can use this," Maggie said, her voice firm. "If Karen thinks she can intimidate me into leaving, she's in for a surprise." But Diane raised a hand, her expression serious. "Maggie, this isn't just about proving Karen's guilt. You need to prepare for retaliation. People like her don't back down easily, especially when they have something to lose. If we move forward with this, things could get ugly." "They already are," Maggie replied. "And I'm not running." Diane nodded, handing her a separate file. "Good. Because I've already started coordinating with Brian. We're filing an injunction against any further actions regarding your property, and we've drafted a formal complaint to present to the city council and local media. But you need to stay vigilant. Karen knows you're pushing back, and she won't take that lightly." Maggie left Diane's office feeling a renewed sense of purpose, but her nerves were on edge. That night, as she reviewed the evidence again, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was already planning her next move. Her instincts proved correct. Around midnight, Maggie was jolted awake by the sound of something crashing outside. She bolted out of bed and looked through the window, her heart sinking at the sight of flames licking at the edge of her garage. Someone had set fire to the old structure, and the flames were rapidly spreading. Maggie grabbed her phone and called 911, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She raced outside with a garden hose, trying to contain the fire until the fire department arrived. By the time they got there, most of the garage had been destroyed, but they managed to stop the flames from spreading to the house. The firefighters were professional but concerned. One of them pulled Maggie aside after the flames were out. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "We found traces of accelerant near the garage door. Someone did this on purpose." Maggie's hands clenched into fists. She didn't need to guess who. The police arrived shortly after, taking her statement and promising to investigate, but Maggie knew how these things went. Without concrete evidence tying Karen or her allies to the arson, it would just be another unsolved case. But Maggie wasn't going to wait for the system to catch up. She had her own plans. The next morning, Maggie met with Brian and Diane, laying out her strategy. Together, they decided to escalate things publicly. Diane had already arranged for a reporter from a local paper to meet them at City Hall, where they would file the formal complaint against Karen and the developer. Maggie knew it was risky. Going public could make her an even bigger target, but she was done playing defensively. The confrontation at City Hall was tense. Maggie, Diane, and Brian presented their evidence to the zoning board in front of the reporter, detailing the pattern of harassment, the fraudulent notices, and Karen's connections to the developer. They demanded an investigation into Karen's actions and the removal of her influence in local affairs. Karen arrived halfway through the meeting, her face a mask of cold fury. She sat silently in the back, watching as Maggie laid out the case against her. When it was over, Karen approached Maggie in the hallway, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've done," Karen hissed. "This won't end the way you think it will." Maggie stood her ground, meeting Karen's glare with unwavering resolve. "No, Karen, it won't end the way you think it will. You're finished." The fallout was immediate. The local paper ran a story the next day, exposing Karen's ties to the developer and highlighting the harassment Maggie had endured. Diane's investigation revealed even more damning details, including financial transactions between Karen and the developer that pointed to bribery. The story spread quickly, and soon Karen found herself under intense scrutiny. But Maggie wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Karen still had connections, and the developer wasn't going to let his operation collapse without a fight. 2 nights later, Maggie's fears were confirmed. She woke to the sound of someone trying to force her back door open. Grabbing the baseball bat she kept by her bed, she crept toward the noise, her heart pounding. The security cameras had already alerted her phone, and she glanced at the live feed, seeing 2 figures in dark clothing trying to pry the door open. She didn't hesitate. Maggie hit the panic button on her alarm system, and the deafening siren filled the air. The intruders bolted, disappearing into the night, but not before the cameras captured clear footage of their faces. Maggie immediately sent the footage to Diane and Brian, who forwarded it to the police. The next morning, the police identified one of the intruders as an employee of the private security firm Karen had hired. It was the final piece of the puzzle. With the footage, the financial records, and the public outcry following the news article, the authorities finally had enough to act. Karen was arrested later that week on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and harassment. The developer she worked with was also named in the investigation, his operations coming to a screeching halt as more victims came forward with similar stories. As for Maggie, she finally felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. Her garage was gone, her property had been damaged, and her sense of safety had been shaken, but she had won. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the community was starting to wake up to the extent of her corruption. Standing in her backyard, Maggie looked out at the charred remains of the garage and allowed herself a small smile. It had been a brutal fight, but she had stood her ground. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: her home was hers, and no one was going to take it from her. The weeks following Karen's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. Investigators swarmed the neighborhood, digging into years of shady dealings, fraudulent complaints, and forced sales. Every day seemed to bring new revelations about just how deep Karen's corruption ran. The developer she'd been working with was facing charges for racketeering and property fraud, and several local officials were under investigation for taking bribes to push through false zoning violations. Maggie's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, not as the woman Karen tried to destroy, but as the one who finally stood up to her. At first, the attention made Maggie uncomfortable. She wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed being in the spotlight, and the whispers from neighbors who had once ignored her didn't sit well. But as more people came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation, Maggie began to realize she had done more than just protect her home. She had given others the courage to speak up. One morning, about 2 weeks after Karen's arrest, Maggie found an envelope in her mailbox. It was thick and unmarked, and inside was a handwritten note from one of her neighbors, Mrs. Daniels. "Maggie, I owe you an apology. For years, I turned a blind eye to what Karen was doing. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that it was easier to stay quiet. But you showed me how wrong I was. You stood up for all of us." even when no one stood with you. Thank you for your strength. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." The note brought tears to Maggie's eyes. It was the first real acknowledgement of what she'd endured, and it meant more to her than she expected. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her desk drawer, a reminder of why she'd fought so hard. Despite the relief of Karen's downfall, the aftermath wasn't without challenges. The damage to Maggie's garage had been extensive, and the insurance company was dragging its feet on approving her claim. The cost of repairs loomed over her, but Maggie refused to let it dampen her victory. She hired a contractor to clear the rubble and rebuild, insisting on doing things her way this time stronger, better, and without anyone telling her how it should look. One day, as the contractors worked on the foundation, Diane called with an update. "The case against Karen is rock solid," she said. "She's looking at serious time, and the developer is even worse off. Between your evidence and the other homeowners coming forward, they don't have a leg to stand on." Maggie felt a wave of relief. "It's finally over," she said, though she knew deep down it would take time to feel truly safe again. "Not quite," Diane replied. "There's still the matter of the restitution hearings. You'll probably be entitled to compensation for everything Karen did to you, the damages, the legal fees, even the emotional toll. Make sure you're ready when the time comes." Maggie nodded, though the thought of facing Karen in court again made her stomach turn. But she knew Diane was right. Karen had taken so much from her time, money, peace of mind. Maggie deserved to be made whole, and she wasn't going to let Karen slither out of her responsibility. As the weeks turned into months, life in the neighborhood began to change. Without Karen's oppressive presence, the atmosphere lightened. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with Maggie now waved and stopped to chat. A few even offered to help with the construction of her new garage, eager to make amends for their silence. One afternoon, as Maggie watched the contractors finish the roof, Mrs. Daniels came by with a plate of cookies. She stood beside Maggie, watching the workers with a small smile. "You know, it feels different around here," Mrs. Daniels said after a moment. "Different how?" Maggie asked. "Lighter, freer, like we can all finally breathe again." Maggie nodded. "It does feel that way. But it shouldn't have taken all this to get here." "No, it shouldn't have," Mrs. Daniels agreed. "But sometimes it takes someone brave enough to stand up and say, 'Enough, that was you, Maggie. You showed us that Karen didn't have the power she thought she did.'" Maggie didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled and thanked Mrs. Daniels for the cookies. As the garage neared completion, Maggie started thinking about what she wanted to do with the space. It had always been a storage area, cluttered and unused, but now it felt like an opportunity to create something meaningful. She decided to turn it into a workshop, a place where she could tinker, build, and channel her energy into something positive. The first project she tackled was a simple one, building a new mailbox. The old one had been vandalized so many times during Karen's reign that it barely stood upright anymore. Maggie spent hours sanding, painting, and assembling the new mailbox, pouring her determination into every detail. When it was finished, she stood back and admired her work. It wasn't just a mailbox, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for. On the day the mailbox was installed, Maggie invited a few neighbors over for coffee and snacks. It wasn't a big gathering, just a handful of people who had supported her in small ways throughout the ordeal. They laughed and talked in her backyard, the sound of their voices filling the air with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. As the sun set, Maggie found herself standing alone by the new garage, looking out at her quiet, peaceful street. She thought about everything she had been through, the fear, the anger, the moments of doubt, and felt a deep sense of pride. She had survived. She had fought back. And in doing so, she had reclaimed not just her home, but her sense of control over her own life. Karen's trial came and went, and Maggie attended every hearing. She watched as the woman who had tried so hard to break her sat in the defendant's chair, facing the consequences of her actions. The court ordered Karen to pay restitution to Maggie and the other homeowners she had harassed, and the developer was fined millions for his role in the scheme. It was a satisfying end to a long, grueling battle. Months later, as Maggie worked in her new workshop, she heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Daniels holding a small box. "I found this when I was cleaning out my attic," she said. It belonged to Ellen Moore, the woman who lived here before you. I thought you should have it." Maggie opened the box to find a collection of old photographs, letters, and a journal. As she flipped through the pages, she saw notes Ellen had written about her love for the house, her dreams for the garden, and the joy she felt living there before everything fell apart. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes as she read. Ellen hadn't been able to hold on to the home, but Maggie had, and now she was determined to honor Ellen's memory by making it a place filled with light, resilience, and hope. As Maggie closed the journal and placed it carefully back in the box, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Her fight was over, but her story and the story of her home was just beginning.